In 1845, the city of Pittsburgh caught fire. Not a fire. Not a blaze contained to a block or a district. A fire that consumed over 1,000 buildings across 11 city blocks, left 12,000 people homeless, and caused property damage equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars in today's terms. All from a single source, in a single morning, in a city that had no meaningful way to stop what was coming. The cause was not lightning, not an industrial accident, not an act of war. It was a domestic fire, started with a match, that escaped a back porch on Ferry Street and found the wood-framed, tar-roofed, closely packed cityscape of a 19th century American industrial city waiting for it like a landscape designed specifically to burn. Pittsburgh was not unique. Hamburg burned in 1842. Constantinople burned repeatedly through the 1860s. Chicago burned in 1871. Boston burned in 1872. San Francisco burned in 1906. Every single one of these fires shared a common accelerant. Not wood, not tar, not the close-packed tenements of the urban poor. The match. The cheap, portable, instantly available source of fire that the 19th century had placed in the pocket of every person on Earth, and in doing so, had handed the most destructive force in nature to the most careless species that had ever wielded it. But the match did not begin as a catastrophe. It began as a miracle. And before this story is over, you will understand how humanity spent 200,000 years desperately trying to make fire, and then, in the span of 30 years, made it so easy that it nearly burned down everything we had built. For the first 200,000 years of human existence, fire was the most valuable thing on Earth. Not gold, not land, not food, fire. Fire was warmth in winter, light in darkness, protection from predators, the tool that made food safe to eat and water safe to drink, and clay hard enough to build with. Every civilization that ever rose did so around a controlled flame. Every technology that followed, metalwork, ceramics, glass, bread, required fire as its first ingredient. And for 200,000 years, making fire was one of the most difficult and unreliable things a human being could attempt. The bow drill, a wooden spindle rotated rapidly against a softwood fireboard by a bowstring, could produce an ember in the hands of an expert under ideal conditions in approximately 30 seconds. Under non-ideal conditions, wet wood, exhausted hands, inadequate technique, it produced nothing. Nothing. No fire, no light, no warmth, no cooked food. Flint and steel, striking iron pyrite against flint to produce a spark, was faster but required specific materials not available in every environment, and a tinder preparation so precise that a single gram of moisture in the tinder bundle could end the attempt. The consequence of this difficulty was not merely inconvenience, it was civilizational. Communities that lost their fire, through flood, through storm, through simple accident, faced a crisis so severe that entire social structures were organized around preventing it. In ancient Rome, the Vestal Virgins were not a religious curiosity. They were a fire maintenance institution. 6 women whose sole civic function was to keep the sacred flame of Rome burning without interruption, because a city that lost its fire lost the thread connecting it to survival. The flame going out was not a bad omen. It was the omen, the one that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. This is the world into which the matchstick was about to arrive. A world that needed fire desperately, that organized entire priesthoods around its preservation, that went to extraordinary lengths to keep it alive, and that had absolutely no preparation for what would happen when fire became trivially, dangerously, universally easy to make. The story of the match begins not with a chemist or an engineer, but with a philosopher's accident. In 1669, a German alchemist named Hennig Brand was attempting to distill gold from human urine. He was not successful at the gold, but in the process boiling down enormous quantities of urine in an attempt to isolate a substance he believed held the secret to transmuting base metals, he produced something nobody had ever seen before, a substance that glowed in the dark, that ignited spontaneously in air, that burned with a cold, eerie, blue-white light that seemed to come from nowhere. He called it phosphorus, from the Greek for light-bearer. He kept it secret for years, selling demonstrations of the glowing substance to wealthy patrons across Germany as a kind of alchemical theater. It was extraordinary, inexplicable, and completely uncontrolled. Phosphorus ignited so readily that containing it was itself a technical challenge. What Brand had accidentally discovered was the chemical foundation of the modern match. It would take another 150 years for anyone to figure out what to do with it. In 1826, an English chemist named John Walker, a pharmacist in Stockton-on-Tees, who spent his evenings experimenting with chemical compounds, was stirring a mixture of antimony sulfide, potassium chlorate, and gum arabic with a wooden stick. When he scraped the dried residue off the stick against the stone floor of his laboratory, it ignited. He had invented the friction match. Not phosphorus-based, not self-igniting. Simply a chemical compound on the tip of a stick that produced fire when struck against a rough surface. Walker sold his first matches, he called them friction lights, in cardboard boxes of 50, with a folded piece of sandpaper included for striking. He did not patent the invention. He would later say he considered it too useful to monopolize. That decision, whether born from generosity or simple failure to understand what he had created, would have consequences that Walker could not have imagined, and almost certainly would not have wanted. Within 5 years of Walker's friction light, the match had been copied, modified, improved, and mass-produced across England, France, Germany, and the United States by manufacturers who had no such reservations about monopolization. The critical modification was phosphorus. In 1831, a French chemist named Charles Soria added white phosphorus to the match head formula, producing a match that ignited more reliably, more easily, and more cheaply than Walker's original. It also produced something Walker's match did not. It produced phossy jaw. Phossy jaw, phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, is one of the most grotesque occupational diseases in the history of industrial manufacturing. Workers in match factories, exposed daily to white phosphorus fumes in poorly ventilated rooms, developed a condition in which the phosphorus accumulated in their jawbones, causing the bone to rot from the inside. The jaw swelled, the tissue died. In darkness, the affected bone glowed a faint greenish white, the same eerie luminescence that had made Hennig Brand's discovery seem magical in 1669. Now it was eating factory workers alive. The process was slow. It took months or years of exposure before symptoms appeared, which made causation difficult to establish and even more difficult to prosecute. Factory owners denied the connection. Medical authorities disputed the evidence. Workers, most of them women and children, most of them with no alternative employment, continued to report to the factories. The match industry had, within 30 years of its invention, replicated in miniature the same suppression structure that the arsenic wallpaper industry would deploy a decade later, that the tobacco industry would deploy a century after that. The product was profitable. The harm was deniable. The workers were disposable. And the product was spreading faster than any regulation could follow. By 1850, the match had achieved something that no previous fire-making technology had come close to accomplishing. It had made fire free. Not free in the financial sense, matches cost money, though very little. Free in the cognitive sense. Free in the effort sense. Free from the expertise, the preparation, the specific materials, the practiced technique, the 30 seconds of focused physical effort that every previous method of fire-making had required. Strike, fire, every time, in 1 second, in the rain, with one hand, without thought. For 200,000 years, fire had been a relationship, something humans tended, maintained, protected, and occasionally lost with catastrophic consequences. The match ended that relationship overnight. Fire was now a transaction, and the consequences of that shift were not abstract. They were architectural. They were urban. They were written in the burning skylines of every major city in the industrialized world between 1840 and 1910. The cities that burned in the 19th century burned for many reasons: dry summers, inadequate water pressure, understaffed fire brigades, building codes that lagged decades behind the pace of urban growth. But underneath all of those specific failures was one common condition. Fire had become so easy to start that human carelessness, previously held in check by the effort required to make fire at all, had been completely unleashed. A moment of negligence, a match dropped on dry wood, a fire left unattended for 30 seconds. Pittsburgh, Hamburg, Chicago, Boston, San Francisco. The match did not cause those fires, but it removed the last barrier between human carelessness and the most destructive force in nature. The phossy jaw crisis eventually broke, not through corporate conscience, but through competition. In 1855, a Swedish chemist named Johann Edvard Lundström developed the safety match, separating the reactive chemicals between the match head and the striking surface, so that the match could only ignite when struck against the specific surface provided in the box. Safer, more controlled, less prone to accidental ignition, and manufactured using red phosphorus rather than white, a form of the element that did not accumulate in human bone and did not rot factory workers from the inside. The safety match was adopted across Europe with legislative force. In 1906, an international agreement called the Berne Convention banned white phosphorus matches across the signatory nations. The match factories that had been destroying their workers for decades were compelled, finally, to stop. The workers who had already been destroyed were not compensated. They were not named. Most of them are not remembered. Today, roughly 500 billion matches are produced every year. They are manufactured in automated factories, packaged by machine, sold in boxes of 50 for the price of nothing, and used for tasks so minor, a birthday cake, a candle, a camping stove, that the act of striking one carries no weight, no consequence, no awareness whatsoever of what it represents. You are holding in your fingers the distilled solution to the single greatest practical problem humanity faced for 200,000 years. The Vestal virgins tended their flame in rotating shifts for over 1,000 years because the alternative, a Rome without fire, was too terrible to risk. Johann Edvard Lundström gave you the ability to replace them in 1 second. The cities that burned, Pittsburgh, Hamburg, Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, burned because humanity received that power before it understood what to do with it. Before building codes caught up, before fire brigades scaled to the new reality, before the ordinary carelessness of ordinary people was accounted for in the design of ordinary cities. The match did not teach us respect for fire. It taught us, the hard way, that the easier a destructive power is to access, the more carefully the world around it must be designed to survive our mistakes. We learned that lesson in burning cities. We are still learning its variations today.